So, take 5. Hello, my name is Mage, and welcome to Black and White Thinking. Today's video is one I have been working on in some capacity for a very long time now. Recent events in the world of online discourse have inspired me to get the fuck on with it. I've written this essay 5 times now, all completely different in tone, but rarely in substance. This has been an emotional piece of writing to work on. It has been a wound reopened. But here we go. In today's video, we are going to be talking about ableism, specifically saneism, and the discrimination of people with perceived cognitive or mental differences, and those considered neurotypical. We're going to be discussing the treatment and the discussions around and of people with personality disorders in online spaces, and how the online weaponization of empathy is causing some real harm to some very sick and vulnerable people. Basically, narcissistic abuse isn't real, psychopath is a slur, and no, I'm not actually obsessed with you, random YouTuber with a chip on their shoulder and 200k. I just want you to stop punching down. And on that ironic note, if this video is helpful in any way, please consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean a lot. Thank you. So, hi. If you've never been to this channel before, you might not know this, but my name is Mage and I have a personality disorder. Not sure why I just made that sound like gay, eh? A personality disorder is considered a pretty severe mental illness. For example, the one I have, borderline personality disorder, sometimes referred to as emotionally unstable personality disorder, has an incredibly high suicide and self-harm rate, and it means that generally my life expectancy is expected to be cut by 20 years in comparison to someone without my disorder. I am more likely to die by suicide, as well as literally anything else because of my personality disorder. I am less likely to have children than my peers, less likely to complete education, more likely to be a victim of abuse in both childhood and adulthood. Now, pity party as this may sound, I just wanted to express some of this to help explain how serious the dysfunction and life chances of someone with a personality disorder diagnosis can be. Personality disorders cannot be cured, they can be managed, usually by medicine and serious psychotherapy, both things most people with personality disorders have very little access to. This video is going to cover a lot of sensitive topics, and a lot of them are incredibly personal and important to me. I have been diagnosed with a lot of things, many we will discuss in this video, and the type of discrimination that people with personality disorders suffer, especially those with cluster B personality disorders, is one I have experienced firsthand and will probably experience for the rest of my life. In online spaces recently, and quick side note, I know someone's gonna comment, if online spaces are so bad, just go outside on this video. That's also really ableist, please don't do that. So online spaces have always been a necessity and a detriment to people with personality disorders. I have nowhere to go but the internet because I'm a disabled agoraphobe with no money, but the internet is one of the worst places when it comes to mental health stigmatization. Whether it be Instagram blocking the use of the BPD tag, or self-harm being allowed on Tumblr, or people diagnosing the president on Twitter, or YouTube and TikTok influencers calling each other love-bombing narcissists, the worldwide hellscape can be a highly unpleasant place to be if you have a PD. Recently, this has just increased tenfold. There have been multiple incidents I can and have had issues with. I've interacted with some semi-famous YouTubers, I've broached this subject with them, specifically when they have uploaded videos that are steeped in dangerous language, only for me to be met with literal abuse from their groupies. In my early 20s, I knew I had a PD, and I would discuss this online. I've never been very good at being ashamed of the fact that I am emotional and traumatized. I don't even know how to be. But back then, hardly anyone knew what I was talking about. And I always thought this would be as bad as it would get, right? That people not knowing about cluster Bs was the issue. That if people just knew something about cluster B personality disorders, they would have to be kinder, right? Wrong. Everyone and their mother is either an empath now or has a narcissistic abusive ex. That is specifically what I want to talk about today. And I'm going to be doing my best not to name names, even though I want to, and focus less on the people making terrible comments on the internet and more the people that these comments can affect. So the role order is kind of this. Again, we'll talk about what a personality disorder is and why cluster B personality disorders are specifically stigmatized. Then we're going to talk about why this stigmatization happens and how it is inherently founded in colonial bigotry and the misuse of empathy. And then I'm going to share with you one of the most important things I've done on this channel. I recently spoke to a few people, all self-identified narcissists, who very kindly answered some questions I had about what it's like to navigate your life online when your illness is used as an insult. So please stick around for that, because if people take anything from this video, I would like it to be that people with personality disorders are not monsters, but people. Just like the doctors that diagnose us and the people who vilify us online without question. What is a personality disorder? Well, it's complicated and highly debated, but essentially, to be diagnosed with a personality disorder means that you most likely have feelings and behaviour that are considered different from neurotypical people. And these feelings and behavioural differences affect your life in a chronic way. Personality disorders are manageable and treatable, but often debilitating when left untreated or unacknowledged, which they largely are. And they cannot be diagnosed by general practitioners, only by a psychiatrist or a psychologist in a professional medical setting. Most personality disorders develop in late adolescence and early adulthood, and are usually understood to be caused by both bio and social elements of a person's life. For example, I have BPD, borderline, which, whilst no one can say 100%, was probably caused by not only a genetic propensity within me to mental health issues, but also by significant childhood trauma. There are many personality disorders, and they are commonly classified into 3 separate and badly named groups, known as clusters. Cluster A, known as the suspicious personality disorders, includes paranoid PD, schizotypal PD, and schizoid PD. Cluster B, known as the emotional and impulsive personality disorders, includes antisocial PD, borderline PD, histrionic PD, and narcissistic PD. And Cluster C, known as the anxious personality disorders, includes avoidant PD, dependent PD, and obsessive-compulsive PD. These cluster names can seem pretty scary and off-putting in my personal opinion, but please do not be put off by people having personality disorders. We're just poorly humans who need medicine and therapy. Having a personality disorder is not a moral judgment in any way. It's an acknowledgement of the pain that my brain has suffered through and how I must come to understand myself in order to function like someone neurotypical does. Much like autism, which is not a mental health issue, people with personality disorders are just people, trying to survive in a world that wasn't necessarily built to accommodate our needs. Personality disorders are so intrinsically connected to societal behaviours and how people are expected to react. Some doctors don't even think they are real. They think they are often trauma reactions to a world of terrible things. Regardless, if someone has been diagnosed with a personality disorder, they are probably struggling in some area of their life, if not many, and they will require kindness and support. Illnesses aren't pretty, and that's the truth of it. All personality disorders are stigmatized, but one specific cluster, and if you've been paying attention, I'm sure you can guess which one, seems to scare people more than others. People with Cluster B personality disorders, specifically antisocial PD, narcissistic PD, and borderline PD, are often painted as society's villains, both in the real world and in fiction. The psychopathic, the self-obsessed, and the goddamn bunny boilers. Cluster B suffers it all. Your Dexters and Dennises, your HARLEY and Jokers, your shots of Sharon Stone's vagina, your Norman Bates, and your Patrick Batemans. We very rarely get a break in how we are discussed and depicted. Our illnesses are serious, but our reputation is a joke. And nowhere has this been more clear to me recently in the rise of the concept of narcissistic abuse, and how psychoanalytical and psychological terms are now being used colloquially to describe abusive situations. Words like gaslighting or love bombing, words that are being heavily associated with personality disorders online. Narcissism is a typical attribute of human behaviour. Narcissism being a benign Freudian term used to label a specific type of human self-preservation. The spectrum from self-care to a god complex. We are all narcissistic to some level. Both psychology and psychoanalytics, which are different things, will tell you this. NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, is simply an amplified sense of what is considered average narcissism, and this will cause dysfunction in the life of someone with the diagnosis. It does not mean they have no ability for emotion, and they are not worthy of as much compassion as anyone diagnosed with any other complex illness. And again, NPD is a super complicated diagnosis, one that even the DSM has multiple diagnostic criteria for. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders for the neurotypicals out there. Like, doctors are actually allowed to just pick and choose different diagnostic criteria for this one specific diagnosis. NPD is often diagnosed differently in every person. So yeah, it's complicated and it's subjective. Like, the DSM itself is, and this might shock people, actually kind of problematic. Hashtag cancel the DSM. Personality disorders are far from stagnant, and they are often overlapping. People with BPD have really high rates of comorbidity. If I was diagnosed with NPD, I would neither be upset nor shocked. I would simply adapt the coping mechanisms and behaviour patterns I try to use in my life already, the ones I use to evaluate myself and my feelings in relation to the objective reality in which I exist. There are also common ebbs and flows in behaviour. Someone with NPD will have periods of their life with inflated symptoms that can lead to impairment, but their behaviour, like all human behaviour, will and can change. Again, I don't have an official diagnosis for NPD, but I'm pretty sure I'm a narcissist and I would not be surprised if I got one. Like, I am probably diagnosably narcissistic in some way. Like, for example, I am here right now on YouTube essentially preaching, which is pretty narcissistic. I struggle with negative attention to the point it disarms me and causes deep dysfunction in my day-to-day behaviours, and I am the most jealous, envious witch you will ever meet, constantly comparing myself to others and complaining about how hard I have it, how damn cursed I must be. None of these things are fun, and they sure as fuck don't make me instantly abusive. I wake up every day of my life and actively try not to be abusive, which is probably putting in more effort than the average neurotypical person does and would. NPD, any PD, is not a fun thing to have. And you are not suffering by simply being near people who hypothetically might have one. My narcissistic tendencies have also made me, good at art. They actually make me annoyingly empathetic sometimes and super emotionally driven. That's why I'm a pretty good writer. Also, in many ways, it's kind of just a coping mechanism. I hate myself, and a reaction to trauma, everyone hates me. So yeah, narcissistic abuse isn't real, and doctors cannot always be trusted to be a neutral source when it comes to treating people, especially those with personality disorders. Personality disorders are specifically known for being stigmatized by doctors and even being considered untreatable by a lot of mental health professionals. Personality disorders can only be diagnosed by qualified psychiatrists, and even then, as we are about to get into in a little more detail, personality disorders have a history of discrimination and abuse within the field of medicine. It's been common knowledge for decades now that often psychotherapists are known to have a rule that essentially comes down to just never treat a borderline. It's well known that personality disorder diagnoses are often hounded out down gender orientation and race-based lines. It seems one of the most common and, I guess, integral issues with discussions around personality disorders is that people are scared of what they don't know, and what they seem to know is empathy, moral empathy. And apparently the idea that people with cluster B personality disorders, specifically narcissism, have issues with how empathy intersects with their emotions seems to terrify people. Empathy is no longer a feeling, but a thing that we do, and not being able to do empathy, well, that makes you inhuman, it seems. This leans into the very social, psychological concept that morality and therefore humanity are determined by a human's ability to emotionally connect with another human's feelings. But this isn't real. I mean, it may feel real because of how we live, the ideals and virtues that the current hierarchies propose in whichever given society we live in, but there is no scientific evidence for empathy and morality being vital to each other. I recently read a book by Paul Bloom. He's a professor of psychology at Yale University, and the book is called Against Empathy: The Case for Radical Compassion. and it definitely made me feel a little seen. For a long time, I have kind of had an issue with the moralization of empathy. As someone who has BPD, empathy is a complicated thing for me to both implement and understand sometimes. The relationship between BPD and empathy specifically is so complicated we actually have something called the empathy paradox, which posits the notion, well, how the hell can someone with BPD be really highly empathetic and struggle with understanding it simultaneously? Doctors just don't know yet. This alone is enough to tell me that my moral compass and the decisions I make around my own morality should probably not rely solely on my empathy, that my empathy isn't reliable, I guess. Sure, my ability to feel others' pain may be helpful in some situations, but in others, because I have BPD, it can leave me feeling more than is socially acceptable, more than is healthy. Sometimes I get so righteous, my only emotion is unbridled rage. I'm one of those people that is very much like, cool, so you hurt someone I care about, go die. Because again, I have BPD and I split on people. I try really hard to cope with this, but in these moments I'm actually being empathetic, just selectively. Bloom's book discusses this notion essentially. He discusses how empathy as a measure of morality is irrational and unreliable. The book's a pretty philosophical, rambly mess, I'm not going to lie, and his articles are definitely easier to digest if you do want to read about this, but his thoughts are interesting. Not exactly the same as mine, he thinks people are rational, and I don't necessarily agree with that. But I do agree that empathy does little to advise our moral decisions. At least I do think you shouldn't rely on empathy exclusively to make those decisions. He even points out, like I was just about to, that psychopathy is a colloquialism with no medical or diagnostic basis. Empathy is proven to be biased and has been proven to inspire violence, as well as arguably also encouraging things like altruism and kindness. Empathy is not actually the basis of morality, and this isn't hard information to find. Empathy itself is so philosophical that even the concept of relating it to morality risks pathologizing the mentally ill. If empathy is a measure of how good and human someone is, then we can write autistic people and people with mental illnesses off completely then, I guess. Maybe we should just round up all these unempathetic monsters and sterilize them, murder them, lock them up in camps and experiment on them until they feed us the information we need on the fragility of the human brain. Sanitariums and lobotomies, Mengele and Asperger's, neurodivergent people really do not need your empathy. Empathy does not serve neurodivergent people. Lots of people, like I said, medically, emotionally, and cognitively struggle with the concept of empathy. Lack of empathy does not mean lack of emotion. It doesn't mean lack of love, and it does not mean someone is incapable of compassion. I am not incapable of compassion. My autistic friends, family, lovers are not incapable of compassion or inherently abusive. To empathise with one is to always risk othering another, which is exactly what people accuse people with personality disorders of doing whilst they literally do it to us. The dehumanisation of people is a really dangerous game to play. It is easy to see why so many people view empathy as a powerful force for goodness and moral change. It is easy to see why so many believe that the only problem with empathy is that we often don't have enough of it. I used to believe this as well, but now I don't. Empathy has its merits. It can be a great source of pleasure, involved in art and fiction and sports, and it can be a valuable aspect of intimate relationships, and it can sometimes spark us to be good. But on the whole, it is a poor moral guide. It grounds foolish judgments and often motivates indifference and cruelty. It can lead to irrational and unfair political decisions. It can corrode certain important relationships, such as between a doctor and a patient, and makes us worse at being friends, parents, husbands, and wives. So abuse happens. I've been there, I'm not going into it. I've discussed it in almost every video I've made on this channel though. Some people with cluster B personality disorders may be abusive, however, no more so than anyone else. Quite often, and you can literally just Google this fact, but sources below as always, we are more likely to actually be victims of abuse than abusers ourselves. Now, narcissistic abuse isn't real. Even if you happen to be part of the very small minority of people that have actually been victims of abuse at the hands of someone with narcissistic personality disorder. And I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here because I think people need to hear this. Narcissistic personality disorder is an illness, a complicated one and not one inherently tied by empirical science to abusive behaviours. There isn't even a universal understanding of diagnosable narcissism. Whilst NPD is recognised in the DSM and by ICD standards, a lot of doctors do not agree with this. There are some that think it is simply a symptom of other personality disorders, not a personality disorder on their own. Some psychiatrists think it is a trait of autism spectrum disorder. Narcissism is, again, complicated, and those diagnosed with it, for example in the US, make up less than 1% of the population. As previously mentioned, the DSM has its own pick-and-choose guide for selecting. So yeah, you probably don't know someone with narcissistic personality disorder. And being that the only people that can diagnose PDs are psychiatrists or psychologists in private medical settings, no one has any right to use a medical illness as an adjective or a modifier on the internet. And yeah, we're not going to pretend that this doesn't happen all the time. It's everywhere. From dodgy TV doctors spouting false bullshit they aren't qualified to talk about, but no one will ever bother to check because they abuse the assumptions people make about their title, to YouTubers with 250,000 followers diagnosing their exes to their audience because they read a book by aforementioned terrible TV doctor. Every mummy blogger knows a narcissist, apparently. I'm getting ahead of myself on this one, but again, I just really need people to know that narcissistic abuse is not real. Abuse is real. And to call domestic violence, interpersonal violence, anything other than what it is dangerous to victims of such violence. No one is inherently abusive because of their disorder. Abuse is not passive, it requires choice from the perpetrator. If someone is so mentally ill that they are abusive, then those, whilst super terrible symptoms, are still symptoms of a sickness. And like, if you've ever spent time with anyone who is experiencing symptoms of psychosis, you will know that they can do some unpleasant things. So can someone with narcissism, sure. So can I with BPD. So can someone that is dying of cancer, or someone with postpartum depression, or someone with autism, cancer abuse, autistic abuse, obsessive compulsive abuse, bloody, asthmatic abuse. If these are not phrases you think we should be using, then you shouldn't be using phrases like narcissistic abuse either. Narcissism does not make the abuser. Abuse makes the abuser. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I have been mulling over this whole piece for a while, but one specific incident really pushed me over the edge recently. Well, two, but the first one pales in comparison to the second, so I'm not even going to mention it anymore. There will be no names here, and I'm going to attempt to be as vague here as possible whilst explaining something that had a genuine effect on me and I think serves as a solid example of what I'm discussing in this video. But if you do recognise who I'm talking about, just don't go to their channel and talk about this, like, who gives a shit? They don't. YouTuber A, as we shall refer to her, had a boyfriend with whom she had an abusive relationship. She made a video about it. The video was simply labelled Narcissistic Abuse. In this video, she would talk about her relationships and the abuse she had suffered. I completely believe that she suffered this abuse, and my following opinions do not change that fact. Fuck her ex. However, this YouTuber went on to say that their abusive partner was a narcissistic abuser with NPD, which, issue 1, please don't do that. No matter how shitty a person someone is, if they have a personality disorder, please do not blame the diagnosis for their terrible, inhumane behaviour. It removes responsibility from the abuser and places it on the illness, as well as stigmatising a disorder in the process. Whoever you're bitching about isn't going to see the video, but a 20-year-old with a personality disorder and a tendency for suicidal ideation might. Emotions are not an excuse for ableism. And this is good advice on my behalf, but also irrelevant to my story, because YouTuber A, who after saying her partner had NPD, then says, well, actually I read a book about narcissism and NPD written by someone who doesn't have that diagnosis, and then went on to diagnose my partner via the book. Again, no one but the person with the diagnosis is allowed to talk about the diagnosis, people, and how it affects them personally. It's actually kind of illegal to talk about someone else's private medical history on a public platform, and it's definitely highly inappropriate and probably slanderous to diagnose them on said public platform when you are not their psychotherapist. Even if YouTuber A was a psychotherapist, even if her partner had NPD, which again, we have no source for that, she still wouldn't be allowed to disclose private medical information to thousands of people without their partner's permission. Most of all, it's just a fucking dick move. It's cruel, in my opinion, to use someone else's illness as your tragic backstory. YouTuber A specifically frames her abuse as special abuse in comparison to other types of abuse because she labels it as narcissistic, not only treating people with NPD like monsters, but assumably anyone without a narcissistic abuser is less worthy of our sympathy. This video is really gross, unnecessarily mean, and when I pointed out in the comments that if empathy is so important to morality, then perhaps it should be universal and unconditional and be extended towards the mentally ill, I was basically told I was clearly just a triggered narcissistic abuser myself, who just wanted to actively make someone's life worse because again, and ironically, apparently I lack empathy. And Christ, if I never have to say the word empathy after this video, I'll be happy. If you call yourself an empath, please do not interact with me. YouTuber A's defense for the over an hour-long video of ableism that was basically, well, I read a book by a doctor, so if you have an issue with anyone, it's, medicine, sweetie. Which, like, thank you. That is news to me, as someone with 7 odd separate mental health diagnoses. That the field of medicine might not like me. Totally new information. But for real, if your excuse for ableism is essentially, but a Dr. Phil type says it's okay, you are not well versed enough in the field of psychoanalytics or any psychology to talk about this stuff. You clearly do not interact with enough crazy people to have any real say on how we do or should behave. Doctors, psychiatrists, they have a pretty famous and well-known history of treating people with any brain difference as literal animals. We have been raped and murdered, tortured, lobotomized and electrocuted, and ripped from our homes and our children, all in the name of empathy. From Freud to Shipman, there is no doctor in the world who deserves to be trusted simply on the fact that they are a doctor. Did you know that one of the highest percentages of people with NPD are found in literal medical students? We can all read books. We can all recommend books. Mental health professionals are not a monolith, they are as chaotic and combative as the rest of us. No one knows more about my illness than I do, thanks. If you want to read some books on the real horrors of mental health medicine, its history and how we are more often abused than the abuser, I have loads of recs. My favourite bitchy read is The Madness of Women by Jane Ussher, which dramatically compares BPD with the witch trials. The doctor that YouTuber A was referencing, who I'm not even going to name here because I do not want to risk giving her any more exposure, is a private practitioner, which, red flag 1, who lives in LA, red flag 2, who has her own YouTube channel, red flag 3, where she uploads all her TV guest appearances, red flag 4, and videos exclusively talking about how narcissism is the greatest single evil on the planet. Red flags fucking everywhere. It's just as easy for me to pick this woman apart as she would pick me apart. And honestly, it's racist and classist and just incorrect to assume that someone's doctorate makes them a better person than the people they treat. And yeah, to be clear and to correct myself in YouTuber A, the so-called medical profession this YouTuber recommended not only spends her literal career abusing people with narcissistic personality disorders, she also isn't a medical professional in any way, shape or form. At least in the sense that she never actually fucking went to med school. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, a doctorate in psychology. She is not a psychiatrist, she is not a medical doctor. No more so than I am. YouTuber A completely misunderstood this and presented this fundamental misunderstanding to her audience as truth, which isn't greatly relevant to my point, but is cool, I guess. And as much as I wanted to fill this video with just like, got ya, doctors being wrong, this is horribly triggering for me, and I really shouldn't have to write a history of Sanism 101 for people to treat the mentally ill with respect. Worth mentioning one more time that YouTuber A's partner doesn't even have narcissistic personality disorder. She just thinks they do because she read one book by a television doctor. MPD never had to be part of this conversation about the serious issue of domestic violence against women. I'm not talking about fake medical professionals or potential empaths anymore. I want to come back to the issue at hand. Real people with personality disorders can fucking see you talking about us, and people with NPD are facing this most prominently right now in my opinion. Seeing people mock and demonize you for something you cannot choose fucking hurts. It sucks, and it's awful. It hurts me, personally. And so I decided to ask a few people who would be considered narcissists about what this discussion on the internet does to them, does to their health and their psyche. I asked them if they were, as messed up by this stuff as I was, essentially. I spoke to quite a few people, but there are 2 specific responses I'd like to share with you today, and I hope you, silent audience member, can be open to these people's accounts. So firstly, I asked people the basics: name, pronouns, casual stuff like that, and a little bit about how they came to understand narcissism in their life. Then I asked some more specific questions related to how it feels to exist online with NPD. These questions were: have you come across the term narcissistic abuse in online spaces? Have you ever seen NPD or ASPD or BPD related to abuse online? How do you feel about that phrase? How has the phrase affected how you feel or act in online spaces? Do you feel people have certain assumptions about narcissism online? So one of the first people who helped me out, I'm going to refer to them as S. And this is what they had to say on the subject. And they generally make great points, but they bring up something specific that I want to elaborate a little bit on afterwards. S said, I have come across the term narcissistic abuse in online spaces, and I hate the phrase. I believe the lessons it teaches about abuse, the awareness about love bombing, gaslighting, etc., that can be very useful, but in the end it blames the abuse on a mental disorder their abuser has, which is either very stigmatizing for people with narcissistic personality disorder, or giving the abuser way too much credit. It's caused me to hide my disorder online and to refrain from getting a real diagnosis. People very much feel like NPD equals abuser, which can be very exhausting and can make one very defensive online. So yeah, this kind of sucks, and it really hurts me to think that people, young, mentally ill people, are struggling to find a community and medical help when they need it. S brings up a great point here about diagnosis. NPD is a rare diagnosis to receive, especially if you don't already have a personality disorder diagnosis. Asking to get one is considered shameful in a lot of ways, and that means that most NPD diagnoses end up being reserved not for young, struggling, lower-class people that might need them, but high-class businessmen, doctors, or criminals. The framing of high levels of narcissism as an unfixable evil and not a symptom of sickness means that people who need help will be too scared, too ashamed to try and receive it. This is unfair, but it's also super dangerous. Stigma around illness has historically led to death and desolation. We live in a pandemic as I write this. I've made a video on this channel on the deadly effects of misunderstandings about who is at risk from HIV. Sick people need to be able to access medical care and the help they need. They do not need judgment from doctors or normies. We have plenty of self-loathing of our own. One of the other people I spoke to, who I shall refer to as N, also had a bunch of interesting things to say. One of the things they mentioned was that the first time that they really found out about NPD was from the doctor in YouTuber A's video. They said it was especially hard to find objective resources for NPD when they wanted to read more about it. This doctor, and many like her, are the exact people that perpetuate the notion of the evil narcissist or the violent psychopath or the stalker borderline, so they can sell books to people like YouTuber A, not to serve the needs of people like S and N or even myself, who require medical help. And then she dares to even call herself a doctor. She does this knowing people will assume she has medical qualifications, which they do, and she doesn't. She is nothing more than a ringmaster at a freak show making money from selling tickets to point and laugh at the disabled. As Em points out here, nowadays I am very careful around people who use the term narcissistic, related to abuse, or in any negative way really. Sometimes I want to nicely explain to them that I am hurt by it, knowing that the term is only enforcing stigma around NPD. Then I remember the shit ton of backlash I'd get from that, as it's already happened many times before, and then I just stay quiet, and angrily block others or try to ignore them as long as they're not attacking me personally, because I'm just getting tired, you know? The use of narcissism as a descriptor for abuse creates a dangerous divide between those with personality disorders and those without them. It means that people with narcissistic symptoms will see neurotypical people as their oppressor, as the enemy. And it's really hard to be nice to people who assume you are evil before you have even met them. It's just discrimination. And it is really hard to cope with when you are ill, when everywhere you look, someone is labeling someone else with your disorder or a symptom of it, to paint them as irredeemable members of a society unworthy of your time or compassion. Whether it be the doctor I hate so much I refuse to say her name here, or Gabby fucking Hanna. Everywhere online these days you can find someone blaming narcissism for society's failings, for the abuse they supposedly suffer, for the pain they feel. Narcissism isn't the issue. Bad people are the issue, and to write off all narcissists, or people with NPD, or those that have a different capacity for empathy than the average person, to deem them as monsters, To do this not only absolves neurotypical people from the responsibility they have towards the awful things we all have to deal with, but it also wrongly blames neurodivergence as the issue. Monsters aren't born, they're created. To quote a bi-pirate, they paint the world full of shadows and then they tell their children to stay close to the light. Monsters make us feel better about our own morality, but people aren't monsters. To paint people with NPD or any illness this way is so dangerous. And hypocritical, being that there is nothing more monstrous than othering and disregarding other people's human rights, right? Like, if a narcissist cannot be fixed, what do we do with them? What is society's solution to people like me, or N, or S? To dehumanize an entire group of people in the pursuit of empathy is the most nonsensical and contradictory attempt at moralizing I might have ever seen. And crazy people, of all kinds, deserve the basic respect every empath demands in their blog post. The same amount of respect the real stories of abuse hidden behind this bullshit language and unnecessary scapegoating also deserve. Sorry if this was a mess, guys. It was a hard one. I appreciate you, as always. Thanks. Mage out.